Hello, my name is Kate Byrne, and I'm with you tonight to discuss one of my favourite characters, all-time favourite characters of literature and of the small and big screen, Count Dracula. This time of year is a good opportunity for me to watch as many horror films as possible, but of course ones featuring Dracula I think are always the best. So I've called this presentation Dracula Through the Centuries because, as I'm sure you know already, he is the most photographed man ever. It all begins, of course, with Bram Stoker's popular best-selling novel from 1897, which is not the first text to examine vampires, but it kind of crystallizes Dracula as we remember him, as we know him. And this is a novel which is of its time. It explores all the issues that bothered people at the turn of the century as we enter a new era, really, from ideas about colonization, anxiety about homosexuality, because it was just after the Oscar Wilde trials, the birth of kind of proto-feminism with the new woman. There's loads of things going on in that book that are fascinating to look at. But I'm going to talk more about the way in which this book has been brought to life over and over again by people in the 100+ years since. The other thing Stoker is interested in and kind of explores through the blood metaphor in Dracula is syphilis. There's lots of speculation and rumors that he suffered from syphilis, that he contracted it through his activities and that it killed him in the end. There's not definite proof of that, but it would explain some of the anxiety about blood that's going on in the novel, and the way in which sex is represented throughout it. So, of course, this captured the public imagination at the time, and it started something which we've understood ever since, which was this kind of understanding that vampirism and sex are bound up together in perverse and complex ways. But Dracula himself in Stoker's novel, as you'll know if you have read it, it's quite long, but I still make my first years read it and hope that they like it. Dracula himself is a monstrous creature. He's old, he's smelly, he's not attractive at all. And so it's quite a long way that we come from him to more modern interpretations of him as a sex symbol. And that in itself is very perverse, as I'm going to be discussing tonight. So from Dracula in the book, it became a play. It kept on kind of having a life of its own, but the next kind of famous, influential version of Dracula was Nosferatu, an early silent film by a German filmmaker. And as you can see there, the image is pretty iconic. Even if you've never seen this movie from 1922, I'm sure you'll know about the shadow play. And as you see again, I mean, I'm interested in the character of Dracula and how he changes over the years. And here again, he's a monster. He is not an attractive figure. He's an outcast, an outsider. And again, there's interesting kind of representations of sexuality in this, hinted at only, of course, in this movie. The director kind of uses the Dracula figure here. Of course, he's not even called Dracula for copyright reasons, but uses him to explore this notion of the outsider and the monster and all that goes with it. There are problems with this film, I should say. It's potentially very anti-Semitic, and critics since have identified it as such, but it still remains, despite its political problems, it still remains a really powerful masterpiece of early cinema, really, but a powerful kind of representation of this figure who is already by 1922 becoming iconic, becoming so identifiable and powerful. But the monstrosity of that Dracula in that movie is completely, transformed, I think, when we get to the one you guys will probably have seen more of, because there's so many of them and they were so popular, the Hammer horror Dracula. And these are ones which I still enjoy watching today. They're really quite over the top in many cases and melodramatic, but they start this idea of Dracula as a bit of a sex symbol, which I'm going to come back to later. So here we have, of course, Christopher Lee famously playing Dracula from some, nearly 20 years. He starts in 1958, and his performance was so kind of magnetic and powerful. I think in the first film he's only on screen for something like 7 minutes in that, on the right hand there, just Dracula, but he still dominates the whole thing. And it's a famous cast. Peter Cushing is in it as Van Helsing as well, and so these became so popular they kind of resurrected Hammer horror, made it a huge thing, and goes on then. Peter Cushing and Christopher Lee go on to star in some 9 films, I think, in which Dracula becomes reincarnated, brought back from the dead again and again, right until the 70s. It was a character that Christopher Lee started to hate by the end. He was so sick of being identified with him. But he did transform the character into something quite, as I've said, quite magnetic and quite sexy. And you can see there that particularly that sort of erotic representation of vampirism, which is hinted at in the original novel, because Lucy, as we see in the original text, becomes a kind of wanton bride of Dracula, but it's not made explicit until, I think, the Hammer horror people start to bring this out and really make him much more appealing and mainstream, because he becomes a kind of glamorous figure in his sweeping cloak and everything. So from the early 70s then to the late 70s, and I'm sure I'm missing out lots on the way, lots of other versions of Dracula adaptations. I'm only picking the ones that I love, you know, and that I think are really crucial, but there's plenty more, I'm sure, and you will think of those yourselves. So popular is this character, and so endlessly has he been brought to the screen, big and small. I'm going to try and play the trailer for my next version, because it's not perhaps as familiar as the Hammer horror ones, but it is one that completely terrified me as a child. I was afraid to be basically alone in the room for, not exaggerating, for weeks after I caught a glimpse of this, when I shouldn't have this adaptation. So I don't think that the trailer I'm about to show you will traumatize you too much, however, but you'll see what I mean about Dracula becoming from a monster to a kind of romantic figure, hopefully here. Let's see if this works as I try and share it for you. So this is the 1979 version of Dracula.
He has walked through centuries, untouched by time. He has seen empires rise and fall. He possesses the wisdom of the ages. Throughout eternity, no man provoked such terror as such haunting desire. Dracula, starring Frank Langella. With
So you can see what here, hopefully even a brief clip, that this version of Dracula kind of sets him up to be, well, I think the reviews at the time described Dracula as a rock star. You know, he's not just iconic now, he's romantic and charismatic and handsome, and he's a lover, not a fighter, you know, which is in itself pretty horrific, because he still kills women, of course, you know, in no uncertain terms in that movie. So we might have some issues around the 1979 Dracula, but of course it was still very popular, and Frank Langella was already, I think, a big star from representing Dracula on stage, and he had a huge fan base. Here's you know, a description of an interview with Langella, which I thought was quite suggestive in itself. He calls Dracula a dominant, aggressive force. He must have Miss Lucy or he dies. He wants what he wants, and he doesn't analyze it. You know, he's being set up as a man's man here. Dracula as a character is very erotic. A woman can be totally, I must, you know, kind of apologize for this in advance. A woman can be totally passive with Dracula. He made me drink, I couldn't help it, she can say. Dracula seems to represent a kind of doorway to sexual abandonment, not possible with a mere mortal. Besides, he's offering immortality, actually, this is a bit I'm apologizing for. I can't think of a woman who wouldn't like to be taken if it's with love. If you take a woman by force and at the same time gently, you can't fail. Now, this is very much of its time, I think, of kind of 70s idea about gender and consent, which, you know, we don't at all condone today. But Langella, he was just the actor who created Dracula in this film. But what he's suggesting here is interesting in terms of 70s feminism and the changing role of women's sexuality. You know, that now that it's admitted that they want sex, but they want to have the excuse, the guilt removed because Dracula is forcing them, so they don't have to kind of they don't have to feel bad about their desires, basically. And that's something we see again in lots of Dracula versions. You know, he's so powerful they can't help it. It's not their fault, kind of thing. So, as I said, you know, very interesting insight into 70s gender politics there, echoed by lots of other adaptations in the 70s, which feel the same way with what is, we can put bluntly, as rape, you know, but wrapped up as ravishment, they would have called it at the time. And there's the famous version of Poldarks created in the 70s, in which, you know, rape is represented more or less on screen as well, and represented as ravishment. Okay, so dubious, very dubious, dark places Dracula is taking us to, but more than anything else, this idea of him as a hero, a romantic hero, is quite astonishing, I think. Slightly more nuanced maybe, but still romantic, is my next text. This was one that, you know, I kind of grew up with in my time, sort of thing. That was Francis Ford Coppola's version of 1992 of Bram Stoker's Dracula. Again, faithful enough to the core of the source text, Bram Stoker's own, as the title suggests, but adding motivation to this count. He is again romantic, but he is driven by the lost love of Mina, who's reincarnation of his lost lover. And so he becomes a more human figure in this way, because he's mourning, he's grieving, he's angry, he wants revenge, but mostly it's for love. And so weird mixture then of this romantic Dracula and the horrific figure we've seen earlier. As you see on the left, Gary Oldman's almost unrecognizable there. I'm sure any of you've seen this will remember him as the old Count, but much more himself. If you can see in the bottom right, I think you could just about make him out there as a young, handsome, relatively handsome kind of hipster Count. When he restores himself through blood. There he is drinking Keanu Reeves's blood from a shaving cut on the top right there. And this movie's preoccupied with blood and filled with images of blood cells dividing, preoccupied, as often versions are, with the blood transfusions that Lucy receives. And of course, you can understand that it's a kind of modern version of the original text, which was preoccupied with syphilis. Here, in the post-HIV era, blood is associated with HIV and this kind of exploration of sex and death. And that's one of the things so interesting, so compelling about vampirism. It allows us to confront our deepest desires and our darkest fears of illness, of disease, of sickness, and so on, wrapped up together, really, in this bizarre format. Okay, and finally, the text I'm going to look at then is the most recent. As I said, I know there have been others. I've seen some of them, but for reasons of brevity, I'm going to focus, just as my last text, on the BBC Dracula, which was shown only seems a long time ago because it was pre-pandemic, but only last January. And as you can see here, it makes some significant changes to the plot. I don't wish to ruin it for you if you haven't caught up with it in iPlayer, but it reimagines Dracula a kind of Holmes-like version, in the Sherlock version, actually, because it's made by the people who make Sherlock, as you might know. And so even though the first episode seems quite traditional, set in the castle, then on the second on the ship, but finally it's brought up to the modern day as Dracula arrives in Whitby in our era. And then there's some changes which show how the text can move with the times. So Van Helsing is still the vampire hunter, but in her various guises and reincarnations, once again, is now a woman. Excellently played there. And vampirism this time, for this text, is an exploration of genetics and inheritance. Blood is lives, Dracula tells us, and that's because he has a kind of code which he can read of people's lives, of people's souls, through their genetic material, through their blood. And he uses, it's kind of humorously, and this is a slightly tongue-in-cheek version, of course, but he uses the internet, the smartphone, messaging people to his advantage. One of the things about Dracula that's so great is that he's able to adapt to the whatever eras he's in. We see that in the original text. You know, he wants to learn from Jonathan Harker how he's going to fit in Victorian London, and here in the modern version, he has no trouble fitting into modern day 21st century London. All he needs is a smartphone, and suddenly he's got his lawyer on direct dial, and he's messaging and internet dating to reach out to Lucy Westenra. So there are lots of jokes and kind of tongue-in-cheeks bits in this Dracula. You know, he's a lot of one-liners. It feels like a bit of a James Bond Dracula at the same time, but it's also yet, despite all this, much darker and bleaker in outlook, really, than the romantic Draculas that we've seen already. You know, he does, ruining it for you, I'm sorry, spoilers, but he is killed at the end, but so is the heroine Van Helsing. So there's no kind of happy ending. There's no smooth reconciliation. There's no sense, finally, that evil can be staked and put in its box, because actually, as we all know now in this complicated world, evil has an amazing ability to survive. I'm going to talk more about the BBC One Dracula at the Riverside in a couple of weeks' time, so I won't say any more about it now. I'm just going to speculate, finally, about how Dracula might lend itself to future adaptations. And of course, it's not difficult to make a guess how it might work. The easiest way of thinking that Dracula might be reincarnated again in the 21st century is as a response to our current pandemic, because even the picture here of COVID-19 looks like it could be a scene from a Dracula adaptation. The ideas, the themes that are running right through these texts, right back to the original novel, contagion, infection, and blood are things sadly preoccupy us now in our current era as well. And I suppose we can only hope that what makes that sort of dark look at our present possible and palatable is, as with the previous adaptations, a Count who is, if nothing else, easy on the eye, no matter how dastardly and morally dubious he might be. Okay, happy Halloween, everybody.